How do we get a good picture of the character of a god or the nature of a god or what a god is? How do we do that? So this is going to be a video where I'm going to have a lot of discombobulated ideas because I've been thinking about this a lot in the last few days. Well, for years, but I'm kind of focused on the last few days. How do we get a good picture of what a god is? The nature of a god. How do we get a good definition, if is such a thing possible? So part of this little piece, I'll start here. Um, so, for instance, Persephone and Demeter, they were obviously present in Mycenaean culture before, classical Greek culture we know and love. But Hades didn't really pop up until the Iliad, which is part of classical Greek culture. But the Mycenaeans obviously worshipped something very similar, if not Dionysus, but Persephone and Demeter is what I was getting at. Now, Persephone, of course, is the at first kind of kidnapped wife, but then in a happy relationship with Hades, Lord of the Underworld, god of the underworld, in traditional Greek mythology. But Hades didn't seem to pop up as being with Persephone until kind of Hades popped up later on in classical Greek mythology. Before that, it seemed that Persephone was maybe with a Poseidon equivalent, or perhaps another husband or something like that. But Hades doesn't really seem to perform that much of a role as Lord of the Underworld. He's more like a caretaker, like he just kind of like watches over the place. He's not Thanatos, where we get, Thanos. He's not Thanatos. I believe it's Thanatos, who is the actual deliverer of death. Hades doesn't kill anybody. He just kind of watches over the underworld. It's hard to define exactly what he does and really what his purpose is, besides just being kind of loosely in charge of the dead. And, of course, the Greeks' idea of Hades, most people would go there, and it's kind of similar to purgatory later on, though maybe I should make that comparison where it's not great, but it's not terrible. That's most people's lot when they die in classical Greek mythology. And some very, very either high-ranking warriors or very brave warriors. Spartans think that they would definitely go here. Is the Elysian Fields, I believe they were, where that's the idea of closer to the idea of like the Christian heaven, where there's like these great fields of green and there's plenty to eat and everything's sunny and shiny. Whereas most people go to Hades and it's kind of bleak. There's a lot of mist. People are wandering around aimlessly in a forest, not really knowing where they're at. You get in some of these stories, you get a reflection of how a culture thought of death, and generally how much they thought about it, how much they recognized it, and how much they feared it, and what ways they feared it. Does that mean that Hades as a realm doesn't exist, or Hades the god doesn't exist? That's a bigger question. So I think that a realm like Hades exists, and I think the god Hades exists. But then we start getting to my bigger point. All these little snapshots of culture's relation to death and to various beings kind of give us a still life of that god or that other realm or that place, a still life of human reflection upon it, but also I think of that actual place. Um, Most mythology, in my opinion, is living mythology. It changes, it grows. Our understanding of it grows because we grow, we change, and thus our relationship to it changes. So if we get more and more still lives of different realms or different beings or different gods as time progresses, then we can form a more complete picture, a more animate picture, as if you're taking all these little snapshots and it's like one of those books where you're just flipping through and the characters start to move. I think that we can understand gods in that way as well. We start to get a more complete picture. Because, for instance, Odin. So, Tyr by I really wish I knew the source, because I've listened to other Norse podcasts and listened to other Norse speakers speak, and this little source will come up, but then everybody else thinks that Tyr was never in charge of the Norse gods, or he was never the dominant patriarchal figure. But there is a pretty reliable source that kind of dates very far back, that shows Tyr as being he used to be the head of the gods. And he was supplanted by Odin. Odin was, I can get into that in another video, but, Tyr, god of justice, war skill. He was supplanted by Odin, god of so many things. He's got so many names. Odin is a really good example for what I'm talking about, because he has somewhere around 1,000 different names. All these different names have different functions, different qualities. Some Dragodrotin, starting with, I don't know why I'm starting with the darkest. Lord of the Undead, Allfather, All-Father of the gods, All-Father of gods mainly, but it can be understood as All-Father of the people. Wodenaz is one of his oldest names, as far as we can figure out, as far as just history goes, and it means kind of frenzy, kind of berserk, but also an inspired rage. And some of Odin's oldest names, or as far as we can date back, are just both inspiration but also rage in battle. Both kind of not enlightenment as we usually think about it, but an enlightenment in the sense of a higher degree of understanding through intense experience. Of course, Odin has many names that refer to being god of trade, being god of seafaring, being god of wealth, being god of travelers, being god of the market, being a just ruler, a wise one, one most high. And, Wordwolf is a more recent one. I've gotten to that in other videos. Wordwolf, kind of master of words, very, very good at employing words. I don't mean to talk a whole bunch about any one of these gods, but my point is, we get all these little segments of what Odin is, or what his talents are and what he does. And with Odin, it becomes more confusing because he has so many different things that he does and so many different snapshots of him that he just seems like everything. He just seems like everything. And then, another negative one might be Bulwarker, which means evildoer. But also, if he's an evildoer, how can he also be a fair ruler god, and a god of wisdom, and in a way, in some of his names, seem like a god of order. You get all these little tiny pieces, and you're trying to figure out what Odin is, who he is, and it becomes very confusing. Now, what confuses a lot of snapshots of gods is a lot of them are seen through the eyes of Christianity, because monks started writing stuff down. For some cultures, they just didn't write down a whole bunch. Then monks or Roman or just Romans before Christianity started writing stuff down through their own lens. So Snorri Sturluson, he wrote he wrote the Prose Edda. And the Poetic Edda is kind of a combination of poems, but he wrote the Prose Edda. Now, he's a Christian. He was for the unification of Iceland and Norway. And in order to kind of press that, he wanted to display the stories of their, their ancient Norse culture, their pagan past. It wasn't to preserve a picture of these gods as the pagans worshiped them. It was to harken back to the tales of, oh, we share these stories. Wouldn't it be great if like we were together? Look, we're the same peoples. But he was also, not only was he seeing it through a Christian lens, but he was also he had an agenda, and that didn't work out for him. He ended up being killed 2 decades later after he wrote that by the king that he was trying to convince. But that's not to say that Snorri wrote what he wrote down or what he gathered was incorrect. But you start to the more that you understand the actual history behind a lot of these things, you start to see with the people's agendas and different lenses. We later on, who I worship Odin, I work with Odin. Our vision is tainted, or just we see in that hue, the hue of visions of the past that had agendas, or were a limited snapshot, or from people that didn't believe in Odin like that. We are affected and later on. So I think that when you're working with a god or goddess, a whole nother line of thinking here. Like I said, it's kind of discombobulated, but when you're working with a god or goddess, you reaching out, those are the best little pictures. So you grab onto these little stories, these little hues, and these ways to see these beings. You grab onto that, and then you try to tap into that energy. You try to work with that god, that being, and then you start to more little pinpricks of light. It's almost like we're all these different things are poking holes in a sheet of paper between you and that god, and you start to see more and more of that god or goddess or being. And you connecting to that being pokes the biggest holes, in my opinion, to where you can see that being more completely. But at the same time, we're still affected by those hues and those perspectives and those agendas. I think that's why it's very important to realize that just because something's not historical, that you might believe or have, personal gnosis, personal revealed knowledge from a god or a goddess of their nature, either communication to you about them or about things in general, that shouldn't be discounted just because it goes against historical references or how that god was traditionally worked with or looked to. Because those are going to be the clearest pictures if you care about actually worshiping these gods, actually working with them. If you care about just academia, the stories, and getting a picture based on just the history and not, worshiping the god, working with these gods, these beings, then that's a whole nother agenda. And then that's going to be more just founded in what has been written rather than your experience with that god, working with that god or being. The Norse, while having a functioning writing system, did not write down stories. Didn't start writing down stuff. Unfortunately, except for various runestones and inscriptions on those. But I don't think that we should get discouraged either, because I think that if we do care about these gods, if we're drawn to them, we're drawn to these beings, that we just keep on trying on your own. If you're drawn to something, it usually means your soul's, that word's very also packed with a lot of different views of that, but your soul is trying to express and tap into something that it naturally vibes with, that it naturally wants to connect to, is naturally drawn to, so you should follow that, in my opinion. It's and if we're looking at the Judeo-Christian God, not described as looking like anything, though depicted as being Zeus, because it was easier to keep on depicting angels and even God himself in a classical Greek god and goddess kind of way. It was easier to do that. It was easier to flip over to that for the Romans when they started becoming Christian. Beyond that, God is not described as looking a certain way, and very unknowable. Not a lot of ways to really connect to God personally besides praying, which you're asking him for things, talking to God, sure, but with religion, there's not a whole lot of spiritual practice to actually connect. And I was going to do another video about the difference between religion and spirituality. Just briefly, religion is focused on structure, your both societal structure, in my opinion, and don'ts, like, don't steal, don't be lustful, don't be gluttonous, don't be greedy. A lot of don'ts. Focusing on the don'ts so that you fit into that societal structure, so that the community can be held together but also controlled. Spirituality is an entirely personal evolution. It's not, so you're not taking beliefs from somebody else. You'll take some, but then you'll connect to these gods. You'll often do rituals, do magic, and you'll develop as an individual. That's what spirituality is to me, is individual development. Whereas religion is mainly societal belief development. And spirituality is less based on beliefs, but you still have to have beliefs in spirituality. But spirituality is engagement with the divine or the demonic or what have you. Religion is mainly belief-oriented and collaborational groupthink. So the way that the Judeo-Christian God is displayed, what was kept in the Bible after the Second Conference of Constantinople, was completely like groupthink and structural order and follow the rules, follow these rules. There's a lot of spiritual stuff that could have gone into the Bible that was taken out. There's still spiritual stuff in the Bible, don't get me wrong. I'm not as much of a Bible hater as some people I know, but there's a lot of really terrible things in it. But there's a lot of the spiritual things we've taken out that you can do individually, I think, and in favor of groupthink and forcing you into those confines of having to look to a priest instead of actually connecting to God yourself. And that's why we get crazy claims about what prayer can do. And anyway, I'm going off at a tangent. Back to what I was talking about. So I think that figuring out what a god is, I don't think that there's really one definition that's just we can plaster on a god or a goddess for all time. And I think that also the way that you reach out to a god or a goddess is very much how they're going to respond to you. So if you're constantly focused on getting more money, you might really tap into the money side of Odin, and you might just think that he's a money god or something like that. Or you might actually get results, and you might actually get communication and exchange with Odin, based on your money idea of him or your wealth idea of him, and that you might see that part of him. But if you're a warrior, for instance, you might tap into a different way. Or if you're a more shamanic practitioner like me, you'll tap into him through magic and your shamanic, practices. You're going to get a more that side of Odin, and you'll get a bigger picture from that angle. And Odin's kind of a really hard example to use once again because it's so many different things. But there's different sides to all gods and goddesses. And that little hole, wherever you prick that paper and start making that hole, you're gonna see that part of the god or goddess. You're gonna connect through that hole, but somebody else is poking a different hole. But I think that the holes that we poke ourselves are the ones where we get the most accurate and personally relevant part of that god or goddess. There's other gods and goddesses that aren't so vastly named as Odin and in so many different functionalities. Dionysus, god of wine, ecstasy, mystery cults. Unfortunately, Dionysus is mainly worshipped through mystery cults for a long time, so they hold their rituals kind of like they're secretive, and their knowledge about Dionysus is secretive. But Dionysus seems to be very much associated with wine and drinking, and kind of you'd tap into Dionysus you'd be possessed by Dionysus in essence by getting drunk, things like that. So that's more confined than a god like Odin. So I don't think that there is like a one definition. I think that it's a growing picture book that we have to put together ourselves, the different still shots and different experiences we have. The experiences we have the most lively, and then we get a grander understanding and connection to this god or goddess. I hope that wasn't too all over the place. Thank you very much for watching. We're approaching the amount of time I want to take for this. Hit that like button down there. It really helps out the channel. And all of you, have a wonderful day.